Ciao, everyone, and welcome to episode number 6 of Voices of Italy, which is dedicated to the festivity of Carnevale or Carnival in English. But I'm going to use the Italian version for this one because really I'm too used to it. We're in the middle of this year's celebrations, and I have realized that not many people might actually know how we celebrate Carnevale. So, think that if Halloween is the quintessential American celebration of extravagant parties, costumes, and a certain dose of mischief, Italy's equivalent is certainly Carnevale. Carnevale is celebrated all over Italy in big cities and small towns, but the way it's celebrated actually varies a lot from an area to another, from a region to another. And despite being considered a Christian festivity, it's really a time of the year when celebration and silliness take over any religious meaning. As we say in Italian, a carnevale ogni scherzo vale, so all jokes are allowed. Let's dive into the origins, some of the most peculiar and famous celebrations in Italy, and all the cool stuff that you need to know about Carnevale in Italy. Italy is one of the most iconic countries in the world. But what does Italy mean to the world? What does it mean to you?
Buongiorno.
Pizza.
Ciao Bella.
Michelangelo.
Spaghetti.
Mafia. Dolce Vita.
My name is Alessia, I'm Italian, and this is Voices of Italy, the podcast that peels back the layers of the Instagram perfect Italy to reveal everyday stories of authentic, surprising, and messy Italian life. So, at least when I think about Carnevale, I think mostly of childhood memories because in the modern and more commercial version of Carnevale celebrations, it's definitely a children festivity. You see even how the stores change, how the branding of certain stuff changes because, they're targeting kids with that version of the celebration. And understandably, because as a kid, Carnival is probably one of the most fun of celebrations. It means costumes, lots of colorful stuff, and little pieces of paper that we call coriandoli that you just throw on other people in the street. And not talking about also the delicious desserts and all the fun public events like parade, and again lots of costumes. So understandably kids love Carnevale. And the very spirit of that celebration is essentially stopping everything just to have fun together as a community, because I think really it's a very community based kind of festivity. It's not like Christmas. You're supposed, maybe to be more intimately with your loved ones and your family, but Carnevale is a really public, community based kind of celebration, and it's really everywhere, even in the smallest towns. They all have different traditions. So I remember being very surprised as a kid when I first found out that Carnevale is actually a religious festivity, because I used to go to church as a kid and Carnevale didn't look or sound anything like church stuff. And that's probably because, in all actuality, it's not exactly a Christian festivity. The origin is even older and has preserved certain parts, certain characteristics that were then integrated by Christianity in their own traditions. The name Carnevale in itself is probably the biggest influence of Christianity, because probably comes from a Latin expression that meant remove meat, because Carnival represented a last period of feasting and celebration before the period when people abstained from consuming meat during Lent. So it's basically that period before the Lent before Easter. But when it comes to the celebration itself, its origin really goes back to ancient European festivals, for example, the Roman Saturnalia, where there was for everybody a temporary release from social obligations, hierarchies, so everybody can go crazy, essentially. And then that element stayed over in the Middle Ages when it got absorbed by Christianity. So it became this mix of folk and pagan traditions within a Christian time framework. Some of the best known traditions, including all the carnival parades and the masquerade dance, were first actually recorded in this form in medieval Italy. For example, it was during Carnevale that the ruling class would be playfully mocked using masks and disguises. And it's essentially what today we would call satire. And it's still part of the celebration today, specifically in the form of the traditional parade floats. The most famous celebration from this point of view is the Carnevale of Viareggio. It's a town in Tuscany, which is known for these gigantic satirical floats, often featuring political figures, of course, but also pop culture icons. And they are made of these super elaborate paper match caricatures. It's like Italy's version of a political roast, essentially, except that it takes place in a parade and the floats are seriously huge works of art. To give you an example, Silvio Berlusconi has been mocked countless of times in as many floats in Viareggio, where he was depicted the first time in 1987, and then very often, more or less frequently, all the way until the last couple of years of his life before he died. But the figures that are depicted are not necessarily just Italian. For example, in 2019, the Carnival parade gained international attention because of a float depicting Donald Trump, which was already president back then, and he was dressed as the emperor from Warhammer 40K, which is, if you think about it, come on, incredibly creative. But not just Trump, even other international figures like Putin and Kim Jong Un have been depicted in previous parades. And some other floats instead are just more thematic. They reflect the hot topics of contemporary Italy. For example, last year, some of the themes included artificial intelligence, global warming. So, really, things that are being currently debated. And in Viareggio, the floats in the parade compete against each other. So there's also a celebration with different kind of awards, and the winner is announced on the last day of Carnevale. So it's really fun from a lot of point of view, but definitely the floats are what made the celebration really famous. Another typical aspect of Carnevale are masks, but not in just in the sense of the generic meaning that you're thinking of right now. The term in Italy doesn't just refer to something that you put on your face to cover it, but it also means character, as in a character in a story or in a play. And in fact, a lot of those characters come from old forms of Italian theater or play called Commedia dell'arte and Teatro dei Burattini, so puppetry. There are two forms of traditional Italian theater, but other characters were created specifically as symbols of local Carnevale celebrations, as if they were sort of a local mascot. In any case, there's really a lot of them, and each region has their typical Carnevale maschera or multiple masks, and they have some sort of their local regional lore, if you know what I mean. The maschera, so the character, have their own personalities, behaviors. They wear literal masks at times, but not all of them. And they also have usually colorful folk costumes, and they have this sort of cartoonish identity and behaviors, very much like a caricature. um, Two of the most famous are certainly Pulcinella and Arlecchino. Pulcinella is a very typical Campania mask, and it's so popular that really became the quintessential symbol of Carnevale on a national level. Pulcinella sort of embodies the Neapolitan character, positive and negative aspects, sort of a rebellious anti-hero. The other one, Arlecchino, instead is from Lombardy, and in my mind, Carnevale just looks exactly like Arlecchino because of his super colorful diamond patterned costume. And he's more of a trickster, has a carefree and cheerful personality, but he's also very cunning because he's a servant who constantly tries to disrupt his master's plans. So, really represents that spirit of Carnevale perfectly. And for example, in the Viareggio Carnival that I was mentioning, the mask is called burlamacco from the Italian word burla, that means prank, and looks like a clown wearing a red and white costume with this white pom pom on his belly. So that's their mascot in a way. But if we look at the tradition of wearing masks, Carnevale in Venice is definitely the biggest one. Venice is undoubtedly also the most internationally known in terms of Carnevale destinations, and it actually has really ancient roots, but it was abolished in the 18th century and then revived only in 1979. So there was this huge centuries long gap where it was not celebrated. And if you're waiting for me right now to hear me say that Carnival in Venice is overrated and that is an Italian tourist trap, you'll be disappointed because I think it's really cool. During Carnevale, the city really turns into a fairy tale with these extravagant costumes, the dancing, and these beautiful masks. They have been an important feature of the Venetian Carnival. I think they really contribute to that charm. And the production of masks in itself is also one of the peculiarities of Venice, because traditionally the mask makers even had in the Middle Ages sort of a special position in society with their own laws, their own guilds. It was really a prestigious group to be in. And even today, they make an example really of excellent historical craftsmanship, because most masks today are made of gesso, sort of chalk, and gold leaf, and they are handmade painted. They use sometimes natural feathers and gems to decorate them. So, this, of course, makes them quite expensive, which explains why it became a really rare form of craft. Venice also has their own distinct masks in the sense of characters coming from Commedia dell'arte. And in their case, one of the most famous one is called Colombina. She is sort of this low class, cunning woman who is traditionally, guess what, Arlecchino's mistress. So there is also this sort of mix of lores and stories from multiple regions. Other masks, instead, they have an identifying name, but they don't represent a character. They are more symbols for different occupations. For example, a very cool and famous one is the plague doctor mask that you must have seen at least once before. But if Venice is known for elegance, then there's another very famous Carnevale celebration in the town of Ivrea, which is here in the region of Piemonte. And the local Carnevale is pure anarchy. This small town in Piemonte is famous because the celebration is based on one of the world's biggest food fights called the Battle of Oranges. And it involves usually thousands of the locals divided into 9 combat teams and throwing oranges at each other. They're not meant for consumption, the oranges, so there's really no ethical issue here. And the origin of the tradition is actually not confirmed, but it probably dates back to the 19th century, when apparently playful arguments between people on carriages and people in balconies ended up in throwing food like beans, fruit or other types, maybe in sign of mockery or with that kind of meaning. And it's not clear when this passage to throwing oranges in particular happened, but the tradition took shape to symbolize the color of blood essentially shed by these historical revolutions of the past. So it was like a reenactment. Also, because that area of Piedmont has this history of local wars and rebellions during the Middle Ages. But the Battle of Oranges is only one of the elements of the Ivrea Carnival, which has this really complex folkloristic ceremony, really full in historical and legendary evocations. I'm very excited because this year, after living in Piemonte for 7 years, I'm finally going to Ivrea for the first Battle of the Oranges of the year. And I'll probably be there when this episode will be out on Sunday. So I'm really excited to show you some of the pictures and some of the things that I will see over there. So if you want to take a look, make sure to follow the podcast on Instagram, Blue Sky, X, and now on Facebook too. From a specifically cultural point of view, Carnevale, it's really a great event to see how many different folk traditions you can find in different parts of Italy, because this really is a country with a culture that is a unique multi-ethnic blend of many different civilizations that came and lived in this land for centuries, and it really creates this sort of kaleidoscopic view of how Italy looks from a cultural heritage point of view. For example, if we go really north in South Tyrol, which in Italian is called Alto Adige, the Carnevale of this area has more elements of German folk traditions and customs to bid farewell to winter and welcome spring. They have the Carnevale format of colorful parades, elaborate costumes, delicious local treats, but they have their own characters, their own maschere, reflecting more the German folk traditions. They are all more similar to mythical figures and creatures of those German folk stories, and some of whose names I'm not even going to dare pronouncing because I have no German pronunciation skill whatsoever. But the parades also include masquerade that are, for example, the wild man, literally in the sense of a wild man that lives in the woods and looks more like a faun or a satire. And that's, for example, one of the traditional masks as well. And this kind of identity is very typical of that region, of that mountainy German speaking areas, that is completely different. It looks like its own celebration when you compare it to Carnevale in other places. Now, if you go all the way on the opposite side of Italy, you can find this small town in Sicily called Naro in the Agrigento province. And for the record, that's where your lovely host comes from, born and raised. Well, over there, Carnevale almost always coincides with another local celebration called Mandorlo in Fiore, so essentially the almond blossom festival, because it usually takes place in early March to celebrate spring. And actually originated in Naro, and in time became a wider folk festival in Agrigento, which is the province capital. And again, here you have the Carnevale format of costumes, parades, street food, but the tone changes completely from a celebration like the one in Alto Adige that we were mentioning. Here, spring reigns with colorful flowers, folk performances, and parades. There are really a kaleidoscope of colors, and the event became basically an international folk festival with international dance groups coming all the way from really all over the world. Unlike other popular Sicilian Carnevale celebrations, like the ones in Acireale and Sciacca, this one, the Mandorlo in Fiore, really is not the most popular, actually. It's really a local celebration, which makes it, in a way, even more amazing when you think about this powerful international component they have with the parades and the dancing, that it's really one of the main aspects of the celebration. And if you think that it doesn't even have an English language language Wikipedia page. I realized that when preparing for this episode, but where you don't find something on Wikipedia, it sort of doesn't exist internationally. But the Mandorlo in Fiore is also a quite recent traditional event because it actually started only in the 1930s in Naro. However, it is inspired by a much ancient myth from the Greek poet Homer about the blossoming of the almond tree. And the poem is actually linked to this tragic Greek love story between Acamas and Phyllis. The former essentially went to fight the Trojan War. And eventually, when the city of Troy was conquered and the war was over, Phyllis didn't see Acamas coming back. He wasn't with the survivors. So she began to think that he had died in the war, and tragically, she died in despair. So the goddess Athena decided to turn her into an almond tree. And Acamas, who, plot twist, was actually alive and well, when he learned that Phyllis was dead and that she was turned into an almond tree, he went to the tree and hugged it. And that's when the tree started to blossom. It's a really, really beautiful story. And whoever had this idea, of course, gets inspiration from a Greek poem because Agrigento has this really powerful influence from ancient Greece. So it's really, really typical of that area. But because it basically always overlapping with Carnevale, for many people, it's sort of one big celebration. And now I'm gonna say a stereotypical truth, but Carnevale in Italy, of course, also means food. And each region has its own traditional desserts. In general, they all reflect the tradition of using rich ingredients like egg, butter, and sugar before the fasting season begins with the Lent and then comes to Easter. However, there's also super common ones that are really widespread everywhere. And I would say the ultimate Carnevale dessert in this sense is chiacchiere. They're also known with other names. One of the most common ones is bugie. So chiacchiere means cheddar and bugie means lies. So it's just really cute that they're like this mischievous fried pastry strips. And they're very light, airy, and sprinkled usually with powdered sugar. They are found nearly everywhere in every part of Italy under these different names. We even saw them this morning. My boyfriend and I were in this bar downstairs that is also a pasticceria, and right now they have all these traditional Carnevale little treats, and it's really nice to have this seasonal change from this point of view as well. In my area, so in that Agrigento province that I was mentioning before, a very local specialty is called latte fritto or latte fritto, if you want to say it more in a Sicilian way. And it literally means fried milk because it consists of this creamy, milky, sweet custard cut in squares, coated in breadcrumbs, and then deep fried. Is really little pieces of golden perfection. So that I have to say that it's something super, super local, only happens in Carnevale, so you can understand why kids love this celebration. Another really, really famous Carnevale sweet treat is castagnole, and it's really common in different parts of Italy. You can find it, I think, more or less everywhere, but they're more typical of central Italy. And the recipe in itself is actually quite ancient. It dates back to the 18th century, and they're really considered one of the symbols of Carnevale. And it's like this little dough made of egg, sugar, flour, and butter. And then they just made these little balls and they fry them. And you can find them simple or you can find them with the cream, the custard inside, which is, oh my God, really a delight. So again, they're all very, very, very similar. I mean, they rarely involved super different ingredients, but every region has it in its own form and format, and that's why I feel it's a super community based tradition because it's all based on celebrating all together, each one of us with our little derivative way of celebrating. So, have you ever been to one of these famous festivals? I'd love to hear about your experiences in Italy and abroad with Carnevale celebrations. Share with me your Carnevale memories on Instagram and on X at Voices of Italy. And now you can find the podcast also on Facebook. Thank you so much for listening this episode of Voices of Italy Beyond La Dolce Vita. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a review. See you next week. Buon Carnevale, everyone. If after today's episode you'd already started booking your flights for Venice and see the carnival, but then you notice how busy and costly it is, and you decided you're just gonna watch a movie with that vibe, then I recommend Casanova. It's a movie from 2005, loosely based on the life of Giacomo Casanova, for just a little vibe and a little glimpse of the Venetian Carnevale.